I had driven 6 hours by the time I reached the top of that mountain road, and the last of the light was long gone. My friend's cabin sat dark against the pines, and his truck was nowhere in the drive. I almost turned the wheel around and started back down. Then the door opened, and she was standing there in the lamplight with the warmth of the house spilling out behind her. And before I could get a single word out, she smiled and said, "You can stay the night." I don't know why my chest went tight. I only knew I wasn't going to say no. My name is Adam Barrett, and I make things out of wood for a living. Cabinets, tables, built-ins, the kind of slow, quiet work that keeps a man's hands busy and his mouth shut. I have a small shop on the east side of Denver, a lease I can barely afford, and a set of chisels my grandfather left me, and most days that is the whole of my world. I was 34 that autumn, 2 years divorced, no kids, living in a house I mostly used for sleeping. I had taken the job up in Grand Lake because it paid well and because it got me out of the city. A lodge owner up there wanted a full run of built-in shelving and a set of cabinets for the great room. Real wood, hand-fit, the kind of thing nobody asks for anymore. It was a 2-week job, maybe 3, and the drive from Denver was long enough that a motel every night would have eaten half of what I made. So, when Mark offered me his family's cabin, I said yes before he finished the sentence. Mark Dawson had been my friend for the better part of 10 years. We met back when I built the shelving for his first apartment, and somehow the friendship outlasted the apartment, the marriage he got into, and the marriage I got out of. He was the kind of man who would hand you a key and tell you to help yourself to whatever was in the fridge. When he said the cabin was mine for as long as I needed it, I didn't think twice. What I didn't know, driving up that afternoon, was that Mark wasn't going to be there. His text came in when I stopped for gas at the bottom of the pass, the last bar of signal before the road climbed into the trees. Rachel, his wife, was 35 weeks along and had started having contractions that morning. A false alarm, the doctors thought, but he wasn't taking chances. Heading to the hospital, he wrote, "Can't make it up, but my sister Emily's at the cabin, she'll let you in. Stay as long as you want." Sorry, man. I remembered Emily the way you remember the edges of someone. Mark's little sister. She had been at his wedding and at a couple of family cookouts over the years. Always a little quiet, always somewhere near the back of the room. I couldn't have told you the color of her eyes. I figured I'd say hello, drop my bag, stay out of her way, and be gone before the cabinets were dry. That is not how the evening went. She had the door open before I'd even set my bag down on the porch, and she stepped aside to let me in like she'd been expecting me for years. The cabin was warm and low lit, a fire going, the smell of cedar and wood smoke thick in the air. She took my jacket off my hands before I thought to offer it. She poured me a cup of coffee from a pot that was already on, handed me the mug like she'd done it 100 times, and said, "Mark got called back for Rachel. It's just me up here for now, but there's plenty of room." I stood there in the doorway, holding a coffee I hadn't asked for, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time and couldn't name. Not attraction, exactly. Something quieter than that. The feeling of walking into a place and being met. She had already made up the small room off the kitchen for me. Sheets turned down, a lamp on, the window cracked to let in the cold mountain air. On the shelf by the bed, next to a little stack of paperbacks with cracked spines, there was a small carved bird. A wren, I thought, though I only half looked at it. Something about the cuts on it looked familiar, the way a stranger's handwriting can look familiar, and then the thought slipped away and I forgot it. "You must be tired," she said. "I'll leave you to it." But I lay awake a long time, listening to the fire settle and the wind work at the eaves, thinking about how strange it was to be a stranger somewhere and feel, for the first time in 2 years, like I had come home. The job took me down the mountain each morning before the sun cleared the ridge, and it brought me back each evening with sawdust in my collar and my hands aching in that good, honest way. I told myself I'd keep to the small room, keep to myself the way I'd kept to myself for 2 years. That lasted exactly one night. The second evening I came back to find her at the stove, and there were 2 plates set out on the table without either of us having said a word about dinner. I ate with her because it would have been strange not to. And the strange thing, the thing I kept turning over afterward, was how easy it was. There was no work to it, no filling the silences with talk neither of us wanted. I have sat at tables with people I'd known for years and felt more alone than I did across from a woman I barely knew. Emily didn't ask me the questions people ask. She didn't want to know what happened with my marriage, didn't fish for the story the way people do when they smell an old wound. She just seemed to know things. She knew when to talk and when to leave the quiet alone. She knew, somehow, that I liked to work through a problem with my hands moving. So, when the hinge on the pantry door came loose, she handed me a screwdriver and held the door steady and said nothing at all, and we fixed it together in the kind of silence most people can't stand. I found out she was a nurse. Hospice work, down in the valley towns, sitting with people in the last rooms of their lives. She'd been doing it for years, and it had finally caught up with her, the way it does, and she'd come up to the cabin on leave to put herself back together. She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, and I respected her for that. I know something about the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. When she talked about the people she'd sat with, she didn't talk about dying. She talked about who they'd been, the small things, a man who wanted the window open so he could hear the birds, a woman who held her hand and called her by her sister's name. She carried all of it lightly, the way you learn to carry heavy things when you've been carrying them a long while. The evenings started to have a shape. I'd come in, wash the day off my hands, and she'd have something on the stove, nothing fancy. Soup and bread, eggs and onions fried dark the way her grandmother used to make them, the smell of it filling the whole cabin before I was through the door. We'd eat, and then we'd sit by the fire, and we'd talk, or we wouldn't, and both were fine. Some nights the rain turned to hail and drummed on the tin roof so hard we had to raise our voices, and other nights it was so still I could hear the fire tick as it burned down and the logs settle into ash. I started noticing things about her. The way she tucked her feet up under her when she read, the way she went quiet and careful whenever my ex-wife's name came up, which wasn't often, because I didn't like to say it. Ashley. I'd mention her the way you mention weather, flat and factual, and Emily would just nod and let it pass, and somehow that made it easier to set the whole thing down. She never once pried at that bruise. She just made room for it to stop hurting. I started noticing, too, how much she seemed to already know about me. Little things. She knew I took my coffee black. She knew I'd flinch at loud noises, and she never slammed a cabinet the whole time I was there. She knew I didn't like to be thanked, and so she never thanked me. She just did the same quiet thing back. One evening I mentioned an old job I'd done years back, a church pew I'd rebuilt for a parish over in Boulder, and she said, "The one with the water damage on the left side." Before I got there, I stopped with my fork halfway up. "How'd you know that?" She busied herself with the dishes. "Mark must have told me," she said. "He talks about you." Maybe he did. I let it go. But it sat with me, the way a small wrong note sits with you in a song you otherwise love. Mark was not a man who remembered which side of a church pew had water damage. Mark could barely remember my birthday, but I was tired, and the fire was warm, and I didn't want to pull the thread, so I let it lie. There were a dozen small moments like that over those weeks, each one too slight to hold on its own, each one adding to the last. A meal made exactly the way I'd have made it. A silence left open at exactly the right length. It was like being read by someone who had studied the book for a long time, and I couldn't have said, back then, whether it frightened me or whether it was the first thing in 2 years that had made me feel known. The bird kept turning up. I'd notice it on the shelf by my bed, and then a few days later it would be on the mantel, and once I found it on the windowsill over the kitchen sink, angled to face the glass like it was looking out at the trees. One evening I picked it up while she was washing a pot, just to feel the weight of it. It was worn smooth, the way wood gets when it's been handled for years, the grain gone soft and dark under 1,000 touches. Somebody had carried this thing around a long time. Somebody had held it the way you hold a worry stone, until the shape of it went from something made to something loved. "Where'd you get this?" I asked, turning it over in my fingers. Her hand went still over the sink. Just for a second, but I saw it. "A friend," she said. "A long time ago." And then she asked me whether I wanted coffee or tea, and the moment closed over so fast and so smoothly that I set the bird back down and didn't push. That was Emily. She had a way of closing a door so gently you didn't realize it had been shut until you were already on the other side of it. The nights got longer and colder as the job went on. I finished the shelving and started on the cabinet doors. The fine work, the part I loved, the part where you stop measuring in inches and start measuring in whether a thing feels right under your hand. And I found myself hurrying it a little at the lodge each afternoon, catching myself watching the light change through the great room windows, wanting to get back up the mountain before dark. I told myself it was the drive. The road was bad after sunset, was all. But I knew, even then, that it wasn't the road. There was one night, near the end of that first stretch, the fire low, both of us reading, when she fell asleep in the chair across from me, with a book open on her chest. I sat there a while and didn't wake her. I watched the firelight move on her face, and I felt something in me that I had spent 2 years telling myself was broken for good. I thought, I don't even really know this woman. And right behind it, quieter, truer. But she seems to know me. I told myself I was reading too much into a kind stranger being kind. I told myself she was Mark's little sister and I was a guest in her family's house and there was a line there I had no business anywhere near. I told myself a lot of things, sitting by that fire, all of them sensible, and none of them touched the thing I actually felt, which was the plain and terrifying sense of having stumbled into something that had been waiting for me. I put another log on the fire so it would still be warm when she woke, and I went to bed, and I lay there listening to the wind for a long time before it let me sleep. It was the start of the 3rd week when the headlights came up the drive. I knew the sound of that engine before I saw the car. You don't spend 6 years married to someone and forget the particular way they drive, hard on the gas and harder on the brake, like the road owes them something. I was at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and Emily was at the counter slicing bread, and I watched the beams swing across the front windows and rake the wall, and my stomach dropped the way it used to drop in the last year of my marriage, every time I heard that car pull in. "Stay here," I said, and I went out onto the porch. Ashley got out of the car in that way she had, already talking before her feet hit the gravel. She was 32, and she still moved like the whole world was a room she was about to walk into and improve. "Well," she said, looking up at the cabin, "this is cozy." "You're a hard man to find, Adam. Do you know how many people I had to call?" She had a reason, and it was a real one. I'll give her that. There was paperwork. The house we used to share was finally under contract, and the sale couldn't close without my signature on the deed, and I'd been ignoring her calls for 3 weeks because I ignore most things that remind me of that house. She'd gotten the location out of a friend who knew I was doing a job up in Grand Lake. She had the documents in a folder under her arm, tabbed and flagged, ready. All of that was true, and if she had handed me the folder and left, none of the rest would have happened. But Ashley never in her life left a room without finding out where it was soft. Then the door opened behind me, and Emily came out onto the porch with a dish towel still in her hands, and I watched my ex-wife's face change. I have seen a lot of expressions on Ashley's face over the years. This was one I knew well. It was the look she got when she found a soft place to press, the look that used to make my chest go tight before I even knew what she'd found. "Oh," she said, and her voice went sweet in a way that had nothing to do with kindness. "Oh, that's sweet." She looked Emily up and down, slow, the way a cat looks at something small, Mark's little sister. Of course. Up here all alone with him. How convenient for everybody. Ashley, I said, give me the papers, I'll sign them and you can go. She ignored me. She was still looking at Emily. Did he tell you? She said. No, of course he didn't. He doesn't notice anything. He never has. And then, to me, delighted, cruel, like she was handing me a gift. She's wanted you for years, Adam. 10 years, near enough. Ask her. Ask her why she didn't leave when she heard you were coming up here. The porch went very quiet. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the tick of the cooling engine. That's enough, I said. Ask her, Ashley said, warming to it now, because she could feel she'd landed something, and landing something was the only thing that had ever made her feel real. That was the thing about Ashley I'd spent 6 years learning and 2 more years trying to forget. She didn't want me. She never had, not really. What she wanted was to be the one holding the match when the room caught fire. She wanted to watch. Do you really think it's an accident she's up here? Her brother mentioned you were coming. Poor lonely Adam, freshly divorced, and suddenly little Emily decides to extend her stay. It's practically a trap. I remember her at our wedding, you know, standing in the back in that blue dress, watching you the whole night. Mark had a few too many at the reception and told me all about it. His baby sister with her sad little crush that never went anywhere. I always wondered whether she'd ever do anything about it, and here we are. She laughed, short and pleased. Here we are. I looked at Emily. She hadn't said a word. She was standing very still by the door, and she'd stopped even pretending to hold the towel it hung from one hand, forgotten. She wasn't looking at Ashley. She was looking out past both of us, at the dark line of the trees, her jaw set, her free hand gripping the porch rail so hard the knuckles had gone white. On the sill by the door, where she must have set it down when she came out, the little wooden bird sat facing the night. As I watched, she reached over and picked it up and held it against her stomach, both hands around it. The way you hold something you're afraid is about to be taken from you. And that was when I stopped listening to Ashley, because I knew that grip. I'd seen it in the hospice stories Emily told me without telling me she was telling them, the way people hold the one thing in a room that's still theirs when everything else is being carried out the door. Whatever Ashley thought she was exposing, whatever she thought she'd caught out in the open, she had it exactly wrong. This wasn't a woman who'd set a trap. This was a woman who had just watched something private and years old and precious to her get dragged out into the cold and laughed at, and who was holding on to the last of it with both hands. Give me the papers, Ashley, I said again, and this time something in my voice made her stop. I took the folder out of her hands. I found a pen in my shirt pocket, and I braced the folder against the porch post, and I signed my name on every line she'd flagged, right there in the porch light, without reading a single word of it. There was nothing in those pages I needed to read. It was the end of something, and I already knew how it ended. Then I closed the folder and held it out to her. You've got what you came for, I said. Now go. For a second, she looked like she might keep going, might find one more soft place to press. Then she looked at me. Really looked. And whatever she saw in my face made her decide against it. She took the folder and held my eyes a moment longer, waiting for the flinch she'd driven all this way to collect, and when it didn't come, something in her seemed to give up on the whole errand at once. She took the folder. She got back in her car, and she drove off down the mountain with her headlights swinging across the trees. The engine hard on the gas the way it always was, and the sound of it faded and then was gone, and there was just the wind again, and the two of us on the porch, and a great deal that had not been said. Emily was still holding the bird. She still wouldn't look at me. I should go inside, she said. It's cold. We went in eventually, because the cold made the decision for us. She set the bird on the mantel and started clearing plates that didn't need clearing, moving around the kitchen with her back to me, and I stood there and let her, because I've been the one who needs something to do with my hands, and you don't take that away from a person. She's wrong, you know, Emily said finally, to the window. About the trap. It wasn't a trap. She set a plate down. It wasn't a plan at all. That's almost worse, isn't it? Emily. I did extend my stay. She said it fast, like she wanted it out before she lost her nerve. That part's true. Mark said you were coming up, and my leave was almost done, and I told him I wanted a few more weeks to rest, and that was a lie. I stayed because of you, so she's right about that much. But there was never a plan. I never once thought I just wanted to be in the same house as you for a little while, to make you dinner once or twice. That was the whole of it. I would have let you finish your job and drive back down to Denver and never known a thing. She turned around then. Her hands were empty, and she didn't seem to know what to do with them. You don't remember me at all, do you? She said. It wasn't a question. Not really, and there's no reason you should. But I've known you for 9 years, Adam. She crossed the room and took the wren off the mantel and held it out to me on her open palm. You gave me this, she said. You don't remember, and that's all right, but you did. 9 years ago. It was the worst week of my life. I'd just failed my nursing boards. The whole thing. Everything I'd worked 2 years for, and I was sitting at the back of one of Mark's cookouts, trying not to fall apart in front of the whole family. And you didn't know me, and you didn't ask what was wrong. You just sat down at the picnic table with a knife and a block of pine, and you carved this while everybody else was talking, and you set it in front of me, and you said the smallest bird in the woods doesn't quit. I took it from her. And I turned it over in my fingers, in the lamplight, and I saw them the cuts. My cuts, the particular way I finish a wingtip, the little sweep of the blade I've made 10,000 times without thinking, the thing my grandfather taught me and my hands do on their own before my mind catches up. 9 years old, worn soft as a river stone from being carried, and mine. Unmistakably mine. I passed the boards the second time, she said quietly. I kept it in my pocket the whole exam. I've had it with me ever since. Every hard shift, every long night. Every one of those last rooms I told you about it was in my pocket the whole time. You have no idea how many times you got me through something and never once knew you'd done it. I stood there, holding 9 years of my own work in the palm of my hand, and I could not say a single thing. All the small moments that had puzzled me clicked into place at once, how she knew my coffee, how she knew the pew, how the bird kept finding its way into every room I sat in. It hadn't been Mark. It had never been Mark. So, no, she said, and her voice was steadier now, almost gentle, like she'd made her peace with how this was going to go. It wasn't a trap. I'm not clever enough to lay a trap. I couldn't leave. And now you know, and it's humiliating. And I'd at least like to be the one who decides what happens next. So I think I'll pack my things and drive down to Mark's in the morning, and we can both pretend this. No, I said. She stopped. I set the bird down on the table, very carefully, the way she had set it down on the porch, because all of a sudden I understood exactly what it was worth. And I closed the distance between us. You're not going anywhere, I said. And neither am I. She looked up at me, searching my face like she didn't trust what she'd heard, like she'd rehearsed 100 versions of this moment lying awake, and none of them had ever ended this way. I don't know what this is yet, I said. I'm not going to stand here and promise you something clean and finished, because I've done that before and it turned out not to be true. But I've been driving up this mountain faster every night for 3 weeks and telling myself it was about the road. I've been happier in this cabin, with you, than I've been in years. That's not pity, and it's not an accident, and it is not too late. I put my hand over hers, over the small warm space where the bird had been. The smallest bird in the woods doesn't quit. You told me that tonight, but I'm the one who said it first. Turns out I meant it about more than the bird. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals, red and breathing in the dark, and she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 9 years, and she didn't pack her things, and in the morning she was still there, and so was I. We didn't rush anything after that. I want to be honest about it, because the movies make it look like everything changes in a single night. And nothing real changes in a single night. What changed was that we stopped pretending. The bird stayed on the mantel where we could both see it, and neither of us moved it again. I finished the lodge job that week, and then I didn't drive back to Denver the way I'd planned. I found reasons. The cabinets needed a second coat. The lodge owner knew a man up the valley who wanted a dining set, and the man after that wanted a whole kitchen. I took the dining set. Then I took the kitchen. By the time the aspens turned gold, I'd rented a corner of an old machine shop outside Grand Lake and moved half my tools up the mountain, and I'd stopped pretending that was about the work, too. The truth was simpler than any reason I gave. I didn't want to be 6 hours away from her anymore. Emily went back to nursing when she was ready, and not a day before. She found a position with a hospice closer to the mountains, fewer hours, a shorter drive, work she could carry without it hollowing her out the way the old job had. Some evenings, she came home with that particular quiet on her, the one that meant she'd sat with someone through the end of something that day, and on those nights I didn't ask her to talk. I'd just have the fire going and something warm on the stove, the way she'd once done for me on the first night, and I'd learned enough from her by then to know that sitting with a person in their silence is its own kind of language, maybe the truest one there is. She had taught me that without ever setting out to teach me anything. 2 years I'd spent thinking the quiet in my house was loneliness. It turned out I'd just been keeping it alone. Kept with the right person, the same quiet became the best part of my day. Mark and Rachel had their baby as the first snow came to the high country. A girl, healthy and loud and furious at the world the way new babies are. And we drove down through that first snow to meet her. I watched Emily hold her niece by the window in the flat gray light, humming something low under her breath, and I thought about how close I had come to driving back down that mountain the very first night. 6 hours up, and I'd almost turned the truck around at the top of the drive. Mark clapped me on the shoulder and didn't say one word about me and his sister, just handed me a beer and grinned like a man who'd known something for a long time and was glad to finally stop keeping it to himself. That was Mark's way of saying everything he needed to say, and everything, I understood now, he'd been quietly hoping for a good deal longer than he'd ever let on to either of us. Winter came in hard that first year. Snow up to the windowsills, the road down the mountain a white-knuckle drive most mornings, the pines bent under the weight of it. We spent whole weekends without seeing another living soul, just the two of us and the wood stove and the sound of the wind working at the eaves, and I have never in my life been less lonely than I was in those short gray days. I built her a shelf that winter, a long, low run of it along the wall where the morning sun came through first, out of a piece of black walnut I'd been saving for years for something that mattered. And when it was hung and the finish was dry and the whole cabin smelled of oil and cut wood, she took the little wren down from the mantel and set it right in the middle of the shelf, in the one spot where the light hit it first thing every morning. "There," she said, stepping back to look at it, the morning coming up gold along the little carved wing. "Now it doesn't have to hide anymore." Neither did we. It sat out in the open every day after that, in plain sight, the first thing the light touched and the last thing I looked at before I turned off the lamp. Ashley reached out one more time, months later. The house sale had closed clean, the last thread between us finally cut, and her name came up on my phone one evening while Emily and I were standing at the sink doing the dishes. A single message. I don't even remember exactly what it said now, something that wanted a reaction. Something with a hook buried in it. The way everything with Ashley always had a hook buried in it somewhere. I stood there and read it once, and then I set the phone face down on the counter and picked the dish towel back up, and I dried the plate in my hand and set it in the rack, and I didn't answer. There was nothing there for me anymore. That chapter had closed, and I found, a little to my own surprise, that I could leave it closed without it costing me a thing. Emily glanced at the phone, then at me. She didn't ask. She never asked. But I told her anyway, because we'd made a rule without ever once saying it out loud. which was that we didn't leave things sitting in the dark between us. "Ashley," I said, "it's nothing, it's done." And she nodded and handed me the next plate, and that was the whole end of it. The seasons turned the way they do up there, fast and complete. The snow went off the mountain, and the aspens came back green, and then gold again, and I realized one warm afternoon, standing in my own sawdust with the shop door thrown open to the valley, that more than a year had gone by since the night I'd knocked on that door, expecting my friend, and found her instead. 14 months, near enough. 14 months since a stranger opened a door in the lamplight and told me I could stay the night. I came up the drive one evening that second autumn with the truck bed full of walnut and my hands smelling of oil and shavings, and the lights were on in the cabin, warm and gold against the blue dusk, the same as that very first night. Except this time the truck in the drive was mine. This time I wasn't a guest, and I wasn't a stranger, and I wasn't passing through, and when I came through the door, she looked up from the stove, and instead of telling me I could stay the night, she just smiled and said, "You're home." And I was. For the first time in a very long time, I was home. I think about that first night more than I probably should. About how close it was. 6 hours of mountain road. My friend not home. A stranger in the doorway. And every reason in the world to be too tired and too guarded and too far gone to see what was standing right in front of me. I drove all that way looking for nothing more than a place to sleep, and what I found, though it took me weeks to understand it, was a woman who had been quietly holding a door open for 9 years, waiting for me to finally walk through it. She never chased me. She never told me. She just kept a little carved bird in her pocket through every hard room of her life, and let me be a stranger for exactly as long as I needed to be one. The whole time, I thought I was the one who showed up. She had been there all along, holding the door, keeping the fire, saying nothing, asking for nothing, waiting for a man too worn down to notice he was already home. I don't know what I did to deserve the second half of my life turning out kinder than the first. Maybe nobody deserves it. Maybe you just have to be tired enough and open enough to walk through the door when it finally opens in front of you. So let me ask you this. Would you have recognized what she was really offering that night, or would you have missed it, the way I very nearly did? And how long is too long to wait for someone who doesn't even know that you're waiting? If this story stayed with you, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me down in the comments, was Emily brave, or was she foolish, for waiting all those years? I read every single one.